Have you ever stopped and wondered why you react the way you do? Why do some people apologize for everything? Why do some people panic when someone doesn't text them back? Why does one person avoid conflict at all costs while another seems to expect it everywhere they go? Why do some people feel responsible for everyone else's emotions? And why do these patterns feel so familiar that we mistake them for our personality? Part of my curiosity about this comes from my own life. I wasn't raised in the same household as my older siblings. My parents divorced long before I had any awareness of their dynamic. On paper, our childhoods looked very different. Different homes, different experiences, and very different memories. Yet, as I got older, I started noticing that even though our circumstances were different, many of the emotional patterns we experienced were very similar. We worried about similar things, we responded to relationships in very similar ways, and we carried a lot of the same fears. So how does a family change yet somehow stay the same? At first, I assumed the answer had to be genetics, right? That's just what my family did. And not being close with my extended family, this really made sense to me. But as I connected with more of my extended family, I saw that maybe that wasn't the case. So then I wondered if it was just simply learned behavior. And the more I studied psychology, attachment, trauma, and family systems, the more I realized the answer is probably much more complicated than any single theory has an explanation for. Different fields of psychology are all looking at the same phenomenon from different angles. Family systems asks how emotional roles are passed through families. Attachment theory asks how early relationships become our blueprint for later relationships. And internal family systems introduces the idea of legacy burdens. These are the emotional burdens we inherit from previous generations, and researchers like Rachel Yehuda look at how the effects of overwhelming stress leave biological fingerprints that extend beyond the person who experienced the trauma. What happens biologically when human beings experience profound trauma? And can any of those effects reach the next generation? How does yesterday continue showing up today? For a long time, psychology assumed trauma mostly ended with the person who experienced it. If your grandparents lived through war, famine, abuse, or displacement, then those experiences certainly affected them, but it was often assumed the story stopped there. Rachel Yehuda spent years studying Holocaust survivors and their children. She noticed that many of the children of Holocaust survivors struggled with anxiety, altered stress responses, and a greater vulnerability to trauma-related symptoms, even though they had never lived through the Holocaust themselves. Well, the obvious answer is the environment. Imagine trying to rebuild your life after surviving one of the worst atrocities in human history. That trauma doesn't disappear when you become a parent. It shapes how you see danger, how you trust people, how you respond to uncertainty, how you comfort your children, how you react when they're late coming home, and how you respond to conflict. Children don't just inherit stories, they inherit an emotional climate. If you grow up with parents whose nervous systems are always scanning for danger, you learn something about the world before anyone ever sits you down to explain it. Your nervous system begins learning from theirs. That alone can explain a tremendous amount. It certainly explains a lot about how I grew up and what I took with me. But Yehuda wondered if there might be another layer to the story. She began studying epigenetics. Your DNA is often described as the blueprint for building your body. That blueprint doesn't suddenly change because something traumatic happened. Trauma doesn't rewrite your DNA sequence. What epigenetics studies is something different. Think of your DNA as a library. Every cell in your body contains thousands of books. Those books are your genes. Epigenetics is less about changing the books and more about changing which books are opened, when they're opened, and how often they're read. Researchers have found that chronic stress can influence the way certain genes are expressed through mechanisms like DNA methylation and histone modification. Those changes affect how the body responds to stress, inflammation, and other biological processes. Some animal studies suggest that under certain conditions, stress-related changes can persist across generations. Human research has found intriguing associations, especially in families affected by extreme trauma. But I think we need to be a little bit cautious here because science is at its best when it's humble. Rachel Yehuda herself has been careful not to make claims that go beyond the evidence. The research is promising, it's compelling, it's evolving, but we don't yet have evidence that explains every family pattern through epigenetics. And honestly, I don't think we need to, because even if epigenetics explained none of it, we would still have attachment and family systems and observational learning and culture, and we would still have nervous systems learning from one another every single day. Think about it. Imagine 4 generations of one family. A great-grandfather survives combat. He comes home carrying grief, fear, and memories he just can't put into words. No one calls it PTSD because that language doesn't really exist yet. People simply say he isn't the same. He becomes emotionally distant, startles easily, and keeps his emotions locked away because that's what helped him survive. His son grows up believing fathers don't talk about feelings. He learns that vulnerability is weakness. He doesn't mean to pass that lesson on. He just simply lives it. Then his children grow up feeling emotionally alone because love was expressed through silence, sacrifice, hard work, and protection instead of emotional connection. Now, those children become parents. They desperately want to be different. They tell their children they can always talk to them, but when emotions become intense, they shut down because their own nervous systems never learned how to stay present in those moments. But where did that pattern begin? Was it attachment, family systems, observational learning? Could biology have played some role? The answer is it's probably all of them interacting over time. And that's one of the reasons I don't think it's helpful to reduce people to a single explanation. Human beings are more complex than that. We are shaped by biology, by relationships, by our families, by our cultures, by our experiences, and all of those influences are constantly interacting with one another. This is where I find the concept of legacy burdens super useful because it gives us language for something many people have felt but never have been able to describe. The feeling that you're carrying something older than yourself. A fear, a role, a belief, an expectation, a way of surviving that seems to have existed long before you arrived here. And here's the part of Rachel Yehuda's work that gives me the most hope. People sometimes hear conversations about intergenerational trauma and think that they're doomed. That's not what the research says. The same nervous system that learns can relearn. The same brain that adapts to danger can adapt to safety, and the same biology that responds to chronic stress also responds to healing. Supportive relationships change the brain. Secure attachment changes the brain. Therapy changes the brain. Exercise changes the brain. Sleep, mindfulness, and connection all change the brain. Our biology isn't fixed, it's responsive. In other words, if one generation can pass forward the effects of chronic stress, another generation can pass forward the effects of healing. Every generation inherits something, but every generation also leaves something behind. So we can ask ourselves, what kind of legacy are we creating for those who come after us, and what will we do with our own inheritances? Now let's go back to legacy burden. What is it? It's the idea that we can carry emotional beliefs, expectations, fears, or roles that didn't begin with us. They're handed down through families, most of the time indirectly or without anyone realizing it. Think about how children learn. They watch, notice, and absorb. They become experts at reading emotional weather. They notice who gets comforted, criticized, ignored, listened to, who's allowed to have emotions, who isn't. They're always scanning to see what they need to do to belong in their environment. Belonging isn't just emotionally important, it's survival. A child who stayed connected to caregivers had a much better chance of living. Our nervous systems evolved with that reality in mind, so children become incredibly skilled at adapting. If a parent becomes overwhelmed by anger, the child might become invisible. If a parent is unpredictable, the child becomes hypervigilant. And if one parent is emotionally unavailable, the child learns not to need too much. These are signs that the child's nervous system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's adapting. Children don't experience these adaptations as temporary. These become part of our permanent wiring, our identity. Now, understanding where a pattern came from doesn't mean we should keep repeating it. It gives us a place to begin. Internal family systems introduces the idea that some burdens belong not only to us, but to the families and generations that came before us. I want to try a little experiment with you. Think about the family you grew up in. Not the people, but the atmosphere. If someone walked into your home when you were 8 years old, what would they have felt? Now, most of us remember events. Our nervous system remembers the environment. And environments teach us long before words do. When I ask people about their childhood, they'll often say something like, oh, it was great. It wasn't that bad. Just normal ups and downs, normal family. So then I follow up with, well, what happened when someone got angry? Or who did you go to for comfort? And suddenly everything changes because every family has rules. And I'm talking about the invisible rules here, the emotional rules. Rules like don't make mom worry, don't upset dad, don't cry, don't talk about what happens in this house. Always be grateful, always forgive, keep the peace, be the strong one, don't ask for help, don't make a scene, don't disappoint anyone. Sometimes these rules are spoken, but more often they're absorbed. A child doesn't need someone to say your feelings don't matter if every time they express fear, they're told to stop being dramatic. They'll reach that conclusion on their own. Nobody has to say you're responsible for everyone else's happiness. If a child watches one sibling constantly trying to calm arguments or comfort a distressed parent, they begin to understand that's what love looks like. Children are remarkable observers. They're paying attention all the time, even when adults think they're not. They're watching facial expressions, they're listening to tone of voice, they're noticing who gets affection, who gets ignored, who gets blamed, who gets protected, who gets to be vulnerable, who doesn't. Children adapt to their environments to survive, and that means adhering to these rules. And every one of these adaptations solves a problem, at least for a while. So instead of asking, why do I do what I do, maybe try, what problem was this behavior originally solving? Take people pleasing. People often criticize it and tell someone that they need stronger boundaries, and that's easy to say, but imagine growing up in a home where conflict meant screaming or withdrawal or abandonment. Learning to keep everyone happy was intelligence. Harmony increased safety, so why wouldn't someone try to keep the peace? And then that gets carried into adulthood. Keeping your guard up wasn't dysfunction, it was protection. The problem is that our nervous system doesn't automatically update its software. It doesn't wake up one morning and say, good news, you're 38 now. Those childhood rules no longer apply. It assumes yesterday predicts tomorrow because whatever happened before is what they're preparing for again. This is why people sometimes feel guilty in perfectly healthy relationships, or anxious when everything is going well, or suspicious when someone is consistently kind. To the outside world, those reactions seem irrational. To the nervous system, they make perfect sense. It's working from an old map. That old map is often what we're talking about when we discuss legacy burdens. It's a collection of beliefs and emotional expectations that once served an important purpose. They were woven into the culture of the family itself, and it becomes our own inner dialogue. And when we challenge these beliefs, it doesn't feel like we're questioning idea. Feels like we're questioning reality itself. That's the gap between intellectual understanding and nervous system learning. Insight is important, but insight alone rarely changes deeply rooted patterns. You can know all of this and still find yourself reacting in exactly the same ways because adaptation is powerful. It kept you alive. If we can understand the purpose behind the pattern, we can begin deciding whether we still need it. Before we can set it down, though, we need to understand one more piece of the puzzle. How burdens move from one generation to the next without anyone consciously passing them on. Because that, honestly, is where this gets even more fascinating. How do things get passed down without anyone intentionally passing them down? Most parents don't wake up and think, I hope my son grows up believing his worth depends on achievement. Or, I hope my daughter learns that love means abandoning herself. And yet, generation after generation, we often see remarkably similar patterns because we teach what has become normal to us. If something has been part of your life for 40 years, you stop noticing it. It's like walking into a room with a clock that's been ticking your entire life. After a while, you don't hear the clock anymore, but somebody else walks into the room and says, how do you stand that constant ticking? Families work a lot like that. Every family has emotional habits, and over time, those habits become invisible. If you've lived inside that system your entire life, you don't think of these as patterns. You think of them as reality. One of the things that fascinates me about children is how little they need to be told. Adults often focus on what they say. Children pay just as much attention to what adults do. Imagine a father telling his son, it's okay to cry. Then imagine that same father never crying himself. Never talking about fear or admitting uncertainty, never apologizing. The child receives two messages. one through words, the other through observation. Guess which one usually carries more weight? This is where I think family systems theory gives us one of its greatest insights. It reminds us that no one develops in isolation. Every person grows inside a system. When one part of that system changes, every other part responds. The roles we have in these systems often stabilize the family until years later when they become prisons. I've met people who still feel responsible for keeping peace between family members who've been divorced for 20 years and adults who feel guilty relaxing because someone in their childhood was always struggling. These reactions don't make much sense if we only look at the present. They make much more sense if we look at the system that shaped them. Now, it's easy to hear conversations like this and start blaming parents, and I don't think that's helpful. I'm a parent, and I never wanted to pass any burdens on to my children, but I did, long before I even knew what legacy burdens were. They were just the rules, but our parents probably inherited burdens too. Maybe your mother grew up believing she had to earn love through self-sacrifice. Maybe your father learned that emotions were dangerous because no one ever responded safely to his. Maybe your grandparents lived through poverty or war or addiction or loss or abuse. Their adaptations may have made perfect sense in the world that they lived in, just like yours did. The problem is that adaptations often outlive the conditions that created them. We don't inherit the battlefield, we inherit the atmosphere. And years later, that atmosphere shows up in marriages and friendships and workplaces and our parenting, because it became the lens through which our worlds were understood. But if patterns can be learned, they can also be unlearned, because awareness changes our relationship to what we've inherited. And the first time you recognize a legacy burden, something is going to shift for you. If it can be examined, it can be challenged. And if it can be challenged, it doesn't have to define the rest of your life. The burden may have been handed to you. That doesn't mean it belongs to you forever. So how do you know if you're carrying one? One of the most revealing exercises I've ever done personally is paying attention to guilt. Not whether I feel guilty, what I feel guilty about. Where did that guilt come from? Who taught me that my worth depended on productivity? Who taught me that caring for myself was selfish? Who taught me that love had to be earned? Again, this is not about blame. It's about curiosity, because curiosity helps us separate ourselves from the burden. Instead of saying, oh, I'm anxious, ask, when did anxiety become necessary? Instead of, I'm just a people pleaser, try asking yourself, what happened that made keeping everyone happy feel so important? This changes your relationship with yourself. You're no longer fighting your nervous system. Legacy burdens don't just influence how we see ourselves. They influence who we're drawn to. If chaos feels familiar, calm feels really boring. If inconsistency feels like love, consistency can feel very suspicious. And if you've spent your life earning affection, unconditional love can feel almost uncomfortable. I think part of the answer is that healthy relationships ask us to stop using strategies we've relied on our entire lives. Because if you're not managing everyone else's emotions, who are you? If you're not earning love, how do you know you'll still receive it? Those are legacy questions, and they're uncomfortable because new is uncomfortable, especially when it's healthy. So if these burdens were inherited, how do we begin putting them down? What do we actually do with all of this? Because understanding where a burden came from isn't the same as putting it down. Insight does matter. It gives us a map, but a map isn't the journey. And I really honestly wish that there was an easy answer to this. I wish I could tell you that once you recognize a pattern, it disappears. It doesn't. In fact, I think recognize it is usually the moment people become a little discouraged because they notice that nothing changes, or at least it doesn't feel like it. You have the insight, you understand where the pattern came from, you can predict exactly how you're going to react, and then you react anyway. You catch yourself halfway through an argument and think, I'm doing it again. You hear yourself apologizing when you haven't done anything wrong, and you start taking responsibility for someone else's emotions before you even realize you're doing it. Then you're frustrated, thinking you know better. But that's the problem. Your nervous system wasn't built on knowledge, it was built on experience. It's like learning to ride a bike. Nobody explains balance well enough that you suddenly know how to ride. Your body has to experience balance over and over. until one day something clicks. Relationships work the same way. Your nervous system has to experience something different often enough that it begins expecting something different. I've started thinking of it like this. Every legacy burden is really a prediction. If I'm honest, I'll be rejected. If I disappoint someone, I'll lose the relationship. If I have needs, I'll become a burden. If I stop taking care of everyone else, everything will fall apart. Those aren't just thoughts, they are predictions. And your nervous system is constantly looking for evidence that those predictions are true because it's trying to keep you safe. So if you feel inclined, try this instead. Instead of asking, how do I stop doing this? Try asking, what is my nervous system expecting to happen right now? Imagine your partner seems a little quieter than usual. What's the first story your mind tells? Is it they're upset with me? Okay, pause there. Don't argue with it. Don't try to replace it with a positive affirmation. Just get curious. If they're upset, then what? Well, maybe they'll pull away. And if they pull away, maybe I'll end up alone. There you go. Now we've moved past the behavior and into the fear that's driving it. Legacy burdens almost always have a story underneath them. Look for the story. Now ask, how old does that feeling feel? Not how old are you, how old does the feeling feel? Sometimes you'll notice that your emotional reactions feel much younger than the situation you're in. You're 35 years old, but somehow you feel 8. You feel like you're in trouble, like you've disappointed someone, like you're about to be abandoned. That's important information because your body isn't only reacting to the present, it's reacting to the past at the same time. And when you're able to do this enough, eventually your nervous system starts collecting new evidence. And that's how old predictions begin to lose their grip, because reality slowly became stronger than memory. Your nervous system isn't frozen in time. It's learning every day. And the question is, what is it learning from? Are you surrounded by people who reinforce your oldest fears, or people who gently challenge them? Do your relationships require the same survival strategies you learned as a child, or are they inviting you to become someone different? Sometimes healing doesn't begin by changing yourself. Sometimes it begins by changing the environment that's constantly reminding your nervous system of yesterday. Now let's try another question. What happens if you don't? If your instinct is to fix everyone's emotions, what happens if you simply listen? If your instinct is to assume someone is angry, what happens if you ask instead of guessing? I know it seems small, but you're gathering data. You're asking your nervous system, is the world still exactly the way I learned it was? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it isn't. Over time, when you're willing to question these predictions, the burden gets a little lighter. Laying down a legacy burden isn't forgetting your past. It's noticing when your past is trying to make a prediction about your present and becoming curious enough to ask whether it's still true. Thanks for sticking with me. If this episode resonated with you, please give a like and subscribe. Share with anyone you think might need to hear it too. See you next time.